Invitation to an Exorcism. As Brett entered the stuffy Victorian-style house in the suburbs of Denver, the smell of pet dander and old antiques immediately transported him to another time, to a secluded, discarded cupboard space in his distant childhood, where his most admittedly suppressed fear resided in the form of an old black-and-white grainy video, played and replayed on repeat in his head since he was 8 years old. In that faded yet oddly well-aged memory, a ghost girl, transparent blue, in a white dress, strode across the dining room floor in mid-step in only a snapshot image, completely unaware of him. He hoped that this would be his last time entering the house, but he quickly revised that thinking once realizing that he'd have to return at least one more time to drop off his aunt's bulldog at the end of the month. He was there to do a favor for his Aunt Julie and make some money in the process. Recently graduating from college, the few $100s would go a long way towards supplementing some of his fees racked up from the expensive trips to the grocery store. And there weren't many other gigs on the horizon besides his usual customers who needed a house/dog sitter. Aunt Julie was his most recent customer, who would be attending a university conference that required the entire psychology department to travel out of state for a few weeks. Thankfully, she didn't need a house sitter, as Brett had dreaded the 5 or 10 minutes he would have to spend in the doorway of the mansion while his aunt handed off the leash of her bulldog to him. No, he could take the dog with him home, and he was more than happy to take the invitation to gather his check and leave. Aunt Julie greeted him in the parlor, but her bulldog was absent from the scene. The abundance of porcelain dolls staring at him from the nearest glass case were certainly present, and Brett averted his eyes to an oil painting of a stern-looking woman in a red gown, flashing accusatory eyes in his direction, and he quickly stared at his feet. At age 59, Aunt Julie hobbled forward on her cane, her face heavily caked in makeup but youthful all the same, and genuinely bright and smiling at the sight of him. It had been about a year, since last Thanksgiving, since he'd seen her, and the leg compression and boot on her enlarged foot were somewhat of a surprise for him, although he knew she had complained of a history of gout on several occasions in his company. Brett noticed how cold it was in the parlor, even with all the windows closed and the furnace growling somewhere beneath their feet. The 3 layers of sweaters and scarf around Julie's neck were at least proof enough that he wasn't overreacting. "Brett, Sonny, how long has it been since you've been in my humble abode?" Julie asked him, keeping her wide berth. He couldn't help but notice that she wasn't calling for her dog or handing over the check, as he had hoped to begin their conversation. "It has to be over 10 years, Brett sighed. "It can't have been that long, could it?" she asked rhetorically, shaking her head and allowing a few slivers of silver bangs to slip free from her hair tie. "Surely the night of our last scare wasn't your final visit." "No, I think I made it for a couple more Halloween parties before I got too old," he said. "Yes, I'm afraid I've grown out of that phase as well," she replied, lost in a memory that Brett thought he was currently sharing with her. "You'll be happy to know I haven't used that Ouija board since that night." Brett shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant and inadvertently locking eyes with the glass-eyed doll again. "It's just a toy. I had an overreactive imagination then." "Come now, we know we both have seen something in this house," she ventured with a raised eyebrow. "You didn't tell anyone of the little girl you saw walking across this very floor, until you overheard me telling your mom about the same little girl I saw peek around that corner. There." She indicated the half wall separating the living room from the main stairs. "I saw her as clear as day, and when she saw me, she booked it up those stairs like I was playing tag with her. You blurted out that you saw the same thing, validating both of our stories." "With all the dolls you have, it could be that we both projected the little girl, like a hallucination," Brett offered unconvincingly. Aunt Julie smiled and tapped her cane on the wooden floor. "I'm a psychologist. I'm supposed to say things like that to you," she chortled as she neared the cellar door, fingering the knob. A ripple of pain coursed through Brett's skull, and he had to steady himself against the glass case of dead, staring faces. "You know that wasn't the end of it, don't you?" Aunt Julie asked. "I figured, since you never spoke of it again, that you might have suppressed the rest of your memories of that Halloween night. The remainder of that night was pretty traumatizing for us both." "The rest of the night?" Brett asked. "You and my parents messed around with the Ouija board for fun. But me and my cousins went upstairs to play. We were scared to be in the same room with you." "Correction, your cousins went up to play, but I found you in the basement," Aunt Julie said, opening the door and allowing an even colder wind to invade the parlor. The darkness sitting solid and heavy beyond that door was not disturbed in the slightest by the lamplight flickering on the mantel behind them. "I've never been down there." But accompanying that unwelcome pain in his head was a memory of a dream he'd had once as a kid, where he had stood on the threshold of those basement steps, looking down on a grinning and silvery black panther at the bottom of the stairs. As soon as it moved to clear the distance between them, Brett had reared out of his sleep with what he could only think was comparable to a heart attack, threatening to break open his ribcage. "I heard you screaming down there, and when I went down, you were basically catatonic, unresponsive, and I saw something I'll never forget, something I haven't told anyone. Not your mother, not my late husband," she continued, squaring herself up in front of the solid black doorway. "I don't want to hear any more," Brett said with a heaving breath. "If I could just get the dog and leave." "I'm not going out of town, Brett," she said matter-of-factly, gazing down the steps as he had done in his dream. "I only said that to get you here. I need you to do something for me." "You lied?" She ignored him. "I'm not afraid in this house, not anymore. The demon that lives down there knows this. We're attached, it and me. We have been since I was a girl, but it can't scare me anymore. Ever since it took my husband's life, feeding off him like a cancer, I haven't been afraid to die. Being a widow is much worse than death, the greatest torture of them all, and it successfully broke me. Now it's moved on to new victims, unfortunately. Brett, my neighbors. I get calls all hours of the night from Mrs. Tettridge next door, who says she's seeing our little girl running up and down the stairs. But we both know it's not a little girl. I know you saw it, too, that night, and you fought it, successfully. I don't know what you're talking about. None of that happened. You're the only one who can help me, Brett, to help my neighbors, because you're like me." "Like you? You have a demon inside you, which you've carried for a very long time, I can tell. I have something similar. It's been with me since my mom, God rest her soul, bought me my first child-sized doll at an estate sale. When I brought that doll into the house, I unknowingly let the demon traveling with that doll into my heart. It's been with me ever since. It takes the form of a girl, in hopes that we'll drop our guard. But we were never fooled, were we?" The nightmare was so bright in his mind now, replaying like an unshakable example of déjà vu, which he was no longer convinced was a dream at all. "I saw its true form down there in the basement, when I came to rescue you, and it was throwing dirt at the floor in front of my feet, cowering there in the corner. I could tell it was cornered. It was intimidated by something you did, or something your passenger did, and I looked at it in the face, just briefly. Its snake-like, scaled, greenish face, as its claws tore around its vicinity to throw more dirt at us, and it was gone." "I would remember something like that," Brett croaked, with a hard swallow. "Something that terrifying when you're that young? I've encountered many patients who compartmentalize that kind of trauma. Some of it might bleed out in your dreams. What is your worst nightmare? I know you must have one." Brett thought that the only way to relinquish the building pressure in his chest would be to unclog his throat and speak. "I sometimes dream of a panther stalking me, sneering, just before it pounces, and I wake up." She nodded at the new draft that exhaled from the open basement's gaping mouth. "That must be your passenger. Ever figure out where it might have latched onto you?" Brett swallowed another burning lump. "Sometimes in my dreams, it will morph from the black rabid cat that attacked me once in the green belt behind my house when I was 5. I still have the scars on my legs from where it came at me." "I'm so sorry, Brett, but I'm gonna have to ask you to go down there with me tonight." "Why?" he begged. "Whatever lives inside of you, it doesn't get along with what's inside of me," she replied. "And that Halloween night, the activity in the house died off for a very long time, months even, before I finally saw that little girl on the stairs. The doll, my very first one, disappeared that night as well, and I never found it again. I always thought that was the reptile thing covering its bases. He was vulnerable for the first time. I could see it in his little amber eyes down there in the cellar, and I think he wanted to make sure that his totem, the source of his power, was protected from anyone with the wherewithal to harm it, or him." "I can't be the one to help you," Brett argued. "You need a priest or an exorcist." "We both do, most likely," Julie countered. "But I think you have the next best thing. It's scared, whatever lives down there, more than it ever scared me or my husband." "I wouldn't even know what to do." Julie smiled and took his hand. He grudgingly allowed her to lead him closer to the basement, closer to the ice box beyond. "Just let your black cat do it for you." Julie led the way, slowly down the creaking steps into the dirt floor at the bottom. She allowed Brett to cling to her sweater, and he felt surprisingly safe pressed to her back, where her steady heartbeat seemed to set the pace for his own, jackhammering against her spine. She did not flinch or shake as she reached up to pull the cord on the light bulb above their heads, and they looked around at the unassuming dirt cellar with its haphazard array of boxes and glowing furnace in the corner. It was so cold down there, but Brett felt a pleasant breath of fire against his scalp from the vent directly above him, and he chose to stay there as Julie navigated toward the center of the room. She pointed her cane at the corner opposite the furnace. "That's where I saw it. Do you think it's down here now?" She frowned, closing her eyes. "It's hard to say. It moved around quite a bit, according to what I hear from my neighbors. It could be elsewhere, but it'll show up if we find the doll." "You think it's down here still?" "I don't know where else it could be," she replied. "This is where I had it stashed for the longest time, once I realized it was the cause of all the problems. But it was placed on top of one of the boxes there. And, yes, I've dug through all the boxes, checked every square inch of this house. It's not anywhere obvious. Maybe you can find it for me." "How?" "Let your cat sniff it out." "That's ridiculous. And then what, destroy it?" "I think I should have destroyed it a long time ago, instead of hiding it down here. But it was my most prized possession, even with all the horror attached to it. I loved it in my own way." "I've never heard that destroying cursed objects ever does any good," Brett countered. "I thought you had a scientific explanation for everything," Julie pressed with a knowing smile. "Why do you think I held on to it for so long?" "I tend to agree with you. Something that otherworldly most likely requires destruction through otherworldly means." Brett hugged his arms across his freezing chest defiantly and protectively. "I don't know what you think I can do." The furnace fired on with such force that they both jumped, and the muscles in Brett's back quickly loosened when the warm air washed over him again. He saw the flaps on one of the boxes moving behind his Aunt Julie, and this almost sent him bolting back up the stairs when he realized the boxes were beneath a second air vent connected to the furnace. However, it seemed that the air coming out of the second grate was much more pronounced, and he circled around his aunt with a look of concentration that led him to the air vent with both arms over his head. He was correct that the air was much fiercer there in the back of the basement than the front. He traced the vent back to his former standing place, motioning for Julie to feel what he was feeling without speaking. As soon as she was positioned under the grate by the stairs, they heard the bulldog Harold begin to bark and tear across the hardwood floor with his nails clicking. He bumped something and it fell hard against the floor, and he continued to bark at the foot of the stairs. "We're on to something," Brett breathed quietly. They could not see the dog at the top of the stairwell, but the barks were intensifying and pounding against the eardrums in Brett's head. "Above us?" Julie asked. "In the vent," Brett said. He touched the cold metal of the vent above his head and traced it to the other corner of the basement, to the next grate, and he saw again that even less air was coming through there. Without asking, he extracted the vent cover and peered into the darkness. He saw a glint of light in there, way in the back near the wall, and he knew instinctively that it was a reflection from a glass eye. "It's in—" The dog's bark died, and they heard him gallop away across the floor above, colliding into something else and falling still. What replaced that void of silence was the sound of something pounding through the vent above their heads, and what could only be considered the laughter of a female child. They could even see the metal crumpling as the heavy weight thundered toward Brett. "Grab it!" Aunt Julie screamed from somewhere far away, and Brett reached into the dark mouth of the vent, wrapped his fingers around the moth-eaten dress, and wrenched the child-sized thing out of the vent. And then he dropped it to the floor. Gangly, dripping, scaly claws reached after the broken doll on the ground, but closed around Brett's throat instead, lifting him off the ground until the toes of his sneakers were balanced on the dirt. He looked up into the blood-orange eyes and felt the putrid breath waft over his face as it hissed, speckling him with its lava-hot spit. A deep, cat-like growl replied, vibrating with his chest, and the claws withdrew into the darkness just as the black, silvery blur flashed between Brett's legs and scooped up the old doll in its jaws. It then proceeded toward the stairs, ripping through the fabric parts of the doll like a dog with its chew toy, and the panther made sure to smash the doll's porcelain face against the stairway wall. And then it carried its kill up the stairs, across the den floor, and through the front door without ever opening it. The thing in the vent screamed, and it was no longer a child's voice, but a dragon, screeching as it died. Brett could hear it slithering away, back toward the furnace, and the smoke that poured out of the grates told Aunt Julie and Brett that the reptile was burning. And then the vent was spitting white ash, dusting the dirt floor as the thing's cries receded into nothing. Aunt Julie was quickly at his side, inspecting his neck as he dusted the ash off his own shoulders. "Next, I was going to ask how we were going to rid yourself of your passenger." Aunt Julie said, "but I think you might want to hold on to that one." Harold barked from the top of the stairs, as if to remind them both why Brett was there in the first place. They hugged and laughed there in the middle of the basement, and both of them felt lighter, as if for the first time. "You can put my check in the mail," Brett said.